Hello, everyone. Today we have the honor of introducing a true legend in the aerospace industry, Mr. Eugene Kranz. With a distinguished career spanning over 3 decades at NASA, Mr. Kranz is renowned for his leadership and pivotal role in the Apollo space program, notably as flight director for the historic Apollo 11 lunar landing. His iconic white vest and no nonsense demeanor earned him the nickname the Steely Eyed Missile Man. Mr. Kranz's unwavering dedication to excellence, coupled with his calm under pressure, exemplifies the essence of human ingenuity and exploration. Join us as we delve into the remarkable insights and experiences of this visionary pioneer in space exploration. Hello, Mr. Kranz. Good morning.
Well, good morning. It's sort of a cloudy day here in Houston. The weather is moderating a bit from, it's very rare that we get any freezing weather, but that seems to be past. And I'm ready and up to go for our talk show this morning.
Sure. So, Houston, we don't have a problem. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, now I want to spend some time talking about Apollo 11 and then a little bit about Apollo 13. So, we'll start off with Apollo 11. As flight director for Apollo 11, you were an integral part of the mission that landed Neil Armstrong and team on the moon. Can you talk about the emotions and thoughts running through your mind during those crucial moments of the landing? I when I saw the video that you sent me, someone says, "Oh, we were about to turn blue." Was that you, or was it one of your teammates? Can you just talk about the emotions, at that time?
That the Apollo 11 was somewhat of a strange mission from a standpoint of the emotions and the feelings. And I'll describe it in just a second because I was an aviator, and basically myself and my team are trained to push emotions out, deal only with the facts, the events, the challenges that we have during a period of time. But I'm also I enjoy classical music. And I had two strange occurrences during the Apollo 11 landing. We had significant difficulty due to communications and spacecraft systems problems, and our trajectory had been compromised due to procedural error and undocking from the spacecraft. And but the team very smoothly responded to the challenges we were facing from a triumph standpoint. Basically, communications, basically, we always got just a couple split seconds that we had the data we needed to make the decisions. And as I was approaching the go to begin powered descent, very strange thing, I had just a impression that I was leading a major symphony orchestra in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony here. And I was listening to all of the participants, and they were working so smoothly that this symphony all just became very real to me for just a few moments. And then it passed. I had to get back to work. And it was such a strange that when I spoke up at the Smithsonian, I mentioned it also. But then as we got closer to the surface, and we worked the problems. We acquired the landing radar we needed. Basically, our trajectory was within the boundaries needed for landing. And it was now time, and I think you have the video to give the go for landing. And this is where the choral part, the lyrics of the Ninth Symphony basically come in, the Ode to Joy. So all of a sudden, all of the pieces of this enormous Apollo 11 lunar landing are coming together in one time and place and moment. And all of a sudden, it just passed because now we're counting down seconds of fuel remaining. So it was a very strange. I've never had. Occasionally, as a aviator, uh, you're always busy doing the navigation. If you're in a flight of aircraft, you're communicating, you're leading them. But occasionally, you'll get some vista in the atmosphere, the clouds, the sky, that really gives you the feeling that you are in God's creation there and you are witnessing something that no one else on earth, in the sky, or in the world is now visiting. So it's a strange life, and I think it's unique to aviation and possibly the people at sea, where they have an opportunity to basically find these few moments where emotion just overwhelms you and you recognize your need to get back on track.
Do you? I'm sure. I mean, you mentioned the Ninth Symphony. I can imagine that even though it wasn't playing at that time, that's I'm sure all of you were hearing it, right? Um, now, you said you only had a few seconds of fuel remaining. How many seconds are we talking about?
As we got down closer to the surface, due to the disturbance of our trajectory at undocking, we were landing 3 miles long. And basically, the crew was now faced with landing in a field that was full of craters, large boulders right around the line. And we normally would land with about 120 seconds of fuel remaining. But in this particular case, we found ourselves in Apollo 11, first lunar landing. The crew, and I'd almost have to back up a bit on that. Generally, we had a series of computer program alarms where the computer would restart. It occurred 5 times during the landing. And if you remember, if you've seen the pictures of Neil Armstrong when he was training in the lunar landing test vehicle out at Ellington Field, he had a malfunction of that lunar landing test vehicle. And basically, it tipped over at its side, and he ejected, and he had split seconds between the time that he ejected, his parachute opened, and he landed very close to the crashed test vehicle. Well, Neil, and as an aviator, I can put in Neil's mind, I am going to fly this spacecraft because if something happens, I don't have the ability to eject. I'm going to have to fly it. So Neil began hand on the throttle all the way through the powered descent. And he's trying to compute what is happening with these computer programs, alarms I've had. What is the cause of this thing here? But we're continuing to give him a go for landing. And he should have started looking out the window. The lunar module has 2 windows. And in those 2 windows, there are scribe marks where the computer will tell him, if you look through these 2 scribe marks at this time, you will see where you're going to land. Well, he should have done that around 30,000 feet. And now he's down around 2,000 feet, and he finally does that, and he recognizes he's in a boulder field. So now he has to take over manual control. And as I indicated earlier, we have about 120 seconds of fuel remaining. So he is flying around at a relatively low level across the surface, continuing the descent. And basically, in mission control, we have a backroom controller who's looking at a single analog trace because we have 120 seconds of fuel remaining at a 30% throttle setting. So now the crew is throttling above and below the 30%. So the controller at 120 seconds when we hit low levels started his stopwatch. And he is mentally looking at this trace and adding or subtracting seconds to what he's seeing in his stopwatch. He passes this to a front room controller who gives us the call. It's 60 seconds. And the room gets very quiet at that time, very silent. And then pretty soon it's 30 seconds. And about the time that the controller is going to say 15 seconds that I'm expecting that call, we realize the spacecraft crew has just landed. And he's going through the post-landing checklists right here. Now, the thing that was really challenging, and you address this motion, this is at a time when, from an emotional standpoint, mission control is intensely focused because we have to go through a series of stay, no stay decisions. We have 2 minutes to look at the spacecraft after it's landed and make a decision. Is it safe to remain on the lunar surface until 8 minutes after landing? That gives us a little bit more time to look at the spacecraft. And we look at it, and the room directly behind me in mission control, the viewing room, is cheering, stomping. Yeah, I can hear down in mission control them stomping on the floor. And yet my team has to stay on track. We make the stay, no stay decision for 2 minutes. Then we do it for 8 minutes, and we're still not done because we see several minor aberrations in the spacecraft we got to keep checking. So it's 2 hours when we finally give the crew the final stay decision that we can now express and feel the emotion that the rest of the world has felt the instant we landed. And from my standpoint, that still wasn't over because now I had to go over to a press conference. So now I have to address the media. And it was an hour later before I finally got out. It was a beautiful night. I could look up and I could see the moon when we came back into mission control and say, my God, we've just landed.
Wow, wow. Thank you for recollecting those moments. Just so exciting to just hear that. So can't imagine how it would have been to go through them firsthand. Now, um, the Apollo 11 mission, inspired millions, not just here in America, but all around the world. And like Neil Armstrong rightly said, it was one giant leap for mankind, right? So, how do you think the collective human experience of witnessing this monumental achievement influenced our perception of science and exploration?
It's interesting to reflect on that because if you look at there's many organizations that have tried to establish what were the most monumental, most significant achievements of the past century. And number one seems to be the Oppenheimer and the basically the nuclear age, the beginning of the nuclear age. And the number two is the beginning of the space age, where now people across the entire world, it's interesting. I have had a team out in Australia, and they were photographing people in the outback there, almost the Aborigines, who basically were seeing what was happening. They didn't quite comprehend or understand it, but they were seeing something that they had never seen before. And it was interesting to place the Apollo 11 landing as possibly the most significant event of the prior century. From a personal standpoint, I looked at that as basically the beginning of life in space. That basically we were born to accept the challenge to live in space and to seek out new arenas where basically we can establish, just as we did. I'm going to backtrack a bit. I just did a introduction for a book by Jack Schmitt, and he is the geologist who landed on the moon on the Apollo 17 mission. And Jack is writing his book. It's the journal of the Apollo 17 mission, but he's really doing it for the Artemis generation. And it's a strange technique that he used in writing the book. It isn't his writing. These are the exact words that he and the other crewmen were using and the ground was using. So he pastes this whole thing together so that you don't have to listen to it. You can read it, the exact words that were said all through the lunar expeditions he had. And I was so impressed with the way that he had written the story that I read about 2 books a week. And several years ago, I took a journey with my wife to trace the Lunar and Clark expedition along the Columbia River. And it was amazing that in the process of doing this, we had a lecture from say, writer. He's the person who assembled the journals from the University of Nebraska. And it was reading the Lewis and Clark journals, I could see the similarities between the journals of Lewis and Clark and the journal that Jack Schmitt was writing. And I could see this massive boat that the Lewis and Clark is going up in the Mississippi River. And then they're going up into the area around the Dakotas. It basically was a floating fort.
Hmm.
And I could compare that to the Saturn launch vehicle. I could take the experiments and the reports that they would write, the dialogues, and it was just a new voyage of discovery that Apollo was. So it was interesting to have the challenge to write the introduction to a book, but I had the feeling that Jack Schmitt's writing was very similar to the journals that Lewis and Clark wrote.
Um, you actually mentioned about going outside and looking at the moon after the press conference, right? And on that note, like I had an opportunity to interview Mr. Mileswamy Annadurai. He was the flight director of the first Chandrayaan mission by ISRO, and I asked him the same question. So in 1990, when Voyager 1 turned around and then took a photo of the Earth, right, from billions of miles away, and Carl Sagan famously put it as a pale blue dot. But the landing on the moon happened well before that, right? So, and again, going back to your point about going outside and looking at the moon, uh, you know, how do you think this, the whole mission reshaped our understanding of humanity's place in the universe?
Well, I not only look at the moon, I just take at the sky at night. I can take a look at the universe that extends beyond the moon.
Mm.
We have a cabin up in Colorado where we can take a look at the array of the planets, the stars up there, and the thing that's beautiful right now, they have apps that you can take and put in your cell phone, and you can point that app up a certain area in the sky, and it basically tells you what you're seeing. All of a sudden, this vista of space, the universe opens up. And every time I see something coming down from the Hubble telescope, I would just sit down and say, where are we? Where are we in the science, the history of the universe that we're seeing? We're just beginning to see right back to almost the dawn of creation there. And I find it utterly fascinating and humbling to sit down and say, I'm one little speck in this total microcosm that I'm looking at. And, it's amazing. I always get, I won't say, I won't, not upset's the wrong word. I just don't understand people who don't recognize they are part of a universe and they are not the universe. They're just a minuscule part about that thing. And humility. And my book, it's interesting. I wrote my new book. I talked when I was in flight test. I had a flight test boss, Ralph Saylor, and he really talked about humility. And it was very interesting. And he was talking at that time about respect for people with dirty hands. But basically, we are dirty hands when we're looking out at this place called space, the universe, and you go back and I mean, to me, it's just mind-boggling. It's. I'm an engineer. I am not a poet, and I almost wish I were a poet so I could better express what I feel.
No, I think you did great. Thank you. So, we're already talking about sending people to Mars, right? And but going back to the Apollo mission, the astronauts of Apollo 11, they kind of ventured into the unknown, uh, you know, to say with great conviction and courage, I think it's an understatement. Um, from your perspective, what qualifies, I'm sorry, what qualities and characteristics are essential for individuals who embark on such pioneering journeys of exploration?
Well, it's interesting. I think that I do a talk, and I did it originally at an astronaut reunion. We had just dedicated a tree to Neil Armstrong
Hmm.
at the oak grove that we have outside the Johnson Space Center. And I talked about the convergence of the people of a generation who, when they were born, somehow or other had the DNA of explorers. And I just sit down and say, how does this happen? What is it? Well, I take a look at it. We all became interested in science. We all became interested in engineering, but we also moved a bit further and we became risk takers. And I remember and I write about it in my book, and it's strange. I never thought about risk, but all of a sudden, when I was going to college, we didn't have cars. I would ride with the long range truck drivers, and they would tell me the story of their life. The older ones would talk about the Depression, they'd talk about the Great Plains area and atmospheres that basically choked individuals, humans and cattle. And this sort of was sort of the perspective. So we became what I would say observers on this great thing called Earth, space, rather down the line. And we wanted to become participants. We became aviators. And basically in aviation, this was our real point where we started convergence because we're all pretty much the same age. We were all generally born basically in the late 20s or early 30s. And basically, this was an age where things were changing very rapidly over the end of the First World War. Civilization was expanding. Aviation became prominent there in transportation, which introduced you to the new world out there. And we accepted the fact of that this new era requires risk. So we stepped into the risk where it became a secondary thought as opposed to progress. And basically we kept moving, and we lived with risk. I had 5 pilots die during the period of time that I was in Korea. I was witness to 3 astronauts die during the Apollo 1 fire. But this was a challenge so great and so magnificent and so beautiful that risk was the price of continuing moving forward. The risk is the price of progress. And I think that the Neil Armstrong basically came from that generation. We still have many explorers today. I think it moves into those that were explored the Arctic,
Hmm.
Antarctic. So there's some DNA that I've tried to figure out where it comes from and its source. But seems that risk takers basically get something from their parents, and the parents got something from them. So this goes all the way back to the beginning of civilization. There were people that had to take the risks to move civilization forward, and we are just part of this long story.
Now, can you share something about what Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin shared with you after they returned from quarantine, and also what Michael Collins shared? Because for him, it was a case of something that being so near but yet so far, right? Uh, can you share something about what the three of them shared with you?
Each of the astronauts, I had a very early relationship as a flight director. Neil and Buzz were my spacecraft communicators on my first mission as flight director. So they were the ones that we learned a lot about each other in that place called mission control. The astronauts really worked for their boss, but in mission control, they worked for me. So it's a relationship, a team relationship that you have to build there. Neil Armstrong was very interesting. He and Dave Scott were on the Gemini 8 mission, and it was the first true emergency in space that we had to face, where basically we had a propulsion problem, attitude control problem in the Gemini spacecraft. And basically, the crew wasn't able to identify it until almost too late, where we lost all of our orbital fuel. We had to use part of our reentry fuel. The spacecraft had been spinning up to about 360 degrees per second. And basically, the job was handed over to me to bring them home. And I had only 2 ships at sea and a remote communication site. And basically, I had roughly about 4.5 hours to get them down to a landing in the West Pacific. And we talked about that. We talked about the teamwork and the decision process, because the opportunity was there to, well, let them continue on and come in at the planned landing area, but they'd be extremely low on fuel. And the question is, when we used part of our reentry fuel system, did we compromise the integrity of the seals and everything else that had to work there? So it was my judgment that said, we got to come in, and Neil and Buzz agreed with this thing. So basically, we learned trust in each other. We accepted the fact that risk had to be addressed every step of the way during the mission. Neil was always interesting. He had a surrogate. He used Charlie Duke, his Capcom, to work the mission rules with me. The mission rules are what are we going to do if this happens? And Duke would go over and tell Neil what we had just decided, and Neil would go to the simulators and test them and coming back, and he'd say, we agree with this, but we'd like to make some more instruments. For instance, I'll give you an example. if we have and we did have communications problems going down. And basically, they had to have the confidence that I was going to go to the very last edge before I would call an abort. By the ground rules we had before the crew even started down, we didn't have enough communications to continue. But I also knew that I could start the descent to the landing for another 10 minutes and abort 10 minutes into the landing. So the crew knew how I was going to play the cards if we had a communications problem. So this was related. The other thing about Neil is when we were debriefing, he came over to me one day and he said, "I think our mission proves uh, the quality of American technology, because at that time, Japan was a technology standard in the world." And he just said, "Well, I think we've sort of written a line in the sand here as to what we can do as Americans." Buzz was always a challenge because a very smart guy. And he was always one step ahead of many of my controllers. And he needed to learn a little bit of humility. Okay. And there were times there where it was very frustrating to deal with Neil when I had my team, a 3-man team versus a 1-man guy with his PhD TITAC on. So it was really a ego to get him to play and participate as a team member. Okay. Mike was basically the guy that very few books been written about, but he wrote a great book. And basically, he's solo. And I think, there's times I remember times over the Pacific when I was a solo pilot, where I'd be flying an aircraft in there. And you have the feeling that, hey, I got the mission, I'm in charge. And he knew that basically he had the responsibility after the crew had been in the surface, that if for some reason they didn't have the proper fuel, he'd have to do a rescue mission. So it was the relationship within these 3 people was always very close and formal. I mean, it was they were all different people, different personalities. Personally, I like Neil because he was the kind of college professors with the mustache and the long hair that I had in college there. And because that's the way he approached the mission, he was very humble. He knew he was good, but he was humble. He didn't have to prove it.
Were there any questions from you to him after he returned? Like, did you ask something like, how was it?
No, actually, it's interesting. We always did this in a we go through after a mission, we go through a crew debriefing, a controller debriefing, and a debriefing with the program office where we tie it together. And then we go out to a venue where we can say, where we can let it all, turn it loose. And this is where we talk over the mission. And it's humiliating because basically everybody points out the mistake everybody else did. And these might be very small, but it's interesting. The process of learning is to learn to work laterally as a team. Basically, if a guy's not doing what you think so, step up to that guy and tell him, "Hey, shape up. You need some more work." So most organizations don't do this nowadays. They will accept somebody who's not performing well sitting right next to them. But we are so totally dependent upon every member of the team providing their work that basically we can't afford that. So if somebody's not shaping up, basically his partner, the guy next to him at the console, will tell him. We have 3 levels of review. We have I assess performance of every member of my team. Our training supervisor does the same thing, Sim Soup. And the flight surgeon, from a medical standpoint, will look at him and say, "Is that some guy? Is that guy acting funny? And if so, what is the problem?" So periodically, we would convene and basically we would recommend a change in staffing or a change in job position, or just giving them a break. Tell them, why don't you skip the shift here and we'll get somebody in as your substitute. So it's a, very close and it's very intense. Tell you the story though, which is real quick. Uh, we had I had the Apollo 5 mission was an unmanned lunar module. And a lot of people didn't want to get their immunizations for flu, but this we were right in the flu season in there. And I had a doctor in each side of the door when they walked into the mission control room, and they got their injections or they didn't work as a member of the team.
They still do that at some places these days.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing all that. All I can say is, thank you for, uh, helping land humanity on the moon, and that is something humankind will always remember forever. It's such an amazing moment in history that anyone who has been there during that time, born after that, and the yet to be born, everybody's going to be talking about it for a long, long time. So thank you.